The best way to get into touhou is to not engage with touhou at all, whether it be actually playing the games like a total schmuck or otherwise, and instead play, well, literally anything else. Trust me, you don't want to know how bad things really are. For STGs, shmups for you schmucks, even if you're not willing to pirate, there are like a gazillion of them on Steam, like Hellsinker, Crimson Clover, ESP.RA.DA, Battle Garga, but not the pretentious as fuck Zero Ranger though. Nowadays, though, a bunch of the more modern Steam releases are either re-releases / ports of decade-old gen game or otherwise uninspired as fuck at this point, unfortunately. There's also a bunch of STGs on arcade archives if you have a PS4 or Switch. There's Thunder Dragon 2 for a good STG from there. If you want elaborate lore in your franchise, the Souls games are in that direction, probably less contradicting and serves to have more of a point than what we got here. If you want lore in an STG franchise specifically, R-Type kind of fills that itch if you count R-Type Final 1-2, and probably Tactics, Command 1-2, maybe. And while I have lots of issues with those despite being an R-Type apologist myself, despite Zero Ranger and especially touhou Mother's best efforts to make me hate R-Type, they at least make me consider the death penalty for using the R9 Arrowhead or any other R-Type thing in vain. I'd rather deal with those stupid unlockable ship roster trees and other shit than whatever we got here. If you want good grandiose music in your STG, Taito and a lot of their STG stuff featuring music from the based Zuntata, foolish Zun for taking his moniker from Zuntata as if he can even hope to compare to them, are available in a bunch of places nowadays. The soundtracks for a bunch of Caves STGs range from Baller, Dodonpachi, Dangun Fever and, to perfect, Dodonpachi Daijuan and to a somewhat lesser extent Ketsui fit the bill, though they may be too difficult for most people unless you play the respective baby, novice mode of whatever console, PC port you may find if any. If you want to play as a shrine maiden murdering things, the Kiki Kai K, Pocky Rocky games, whether they be the arcade original, the SFC, SNES games, or the 2022 remake are there for that. Reimu is basically confirmed to be the Santiago Tapaki / Seo-chan's Sonic at this point. It's even more apparent if you've played touhou 1 as that Reimu's moveset is basically just SFC Seo-chan's. If you want to play something like touhou 1, aside from the Kiki Kai Kai games above if they count, Demon Slayer Akagi is right here. https://store.steampowered.com/app/1551230/demon_slayer_akagi/. If you want something that takes ideas from Taito but does something semi-unique on its own, there's the Altinext trilogy, Kamui, Reflex, Altinext 2nd, you could easily find on Steam, which seems inspired despite taking its overall initial ideas from Taito's Rates trilogy, Ray Force, Ray Storm, and Ray Crisis, with Kamui being just Ray Force but easier with redundant hit points per life arc, but Reflex being where the series comes to its own entirely. If you want a franchise that has established a bunch of characters over a bunch of yearly installments and 3/4 arcs each with their own little background and a universe that gets more and more established somewhat, there's the King of Fighters series. At least with them you got at least a couple of games, KOF 98 and KOF 2002 that people care about on a deeper, competitive level without any disclaimer or exception, whereas with touhou the best more experienced STG people can think of as actually good games in the STG side when are touhou 12 and touhou 12.8, Unidentified Fantastic Object and Great Fairy Wars respectively, and even then people end up preferring Phantasmagoria True's touhou fangame over them, and PT doesn't even have a fucking background beyond just fog for most of its stages. And even that isn't as interesting to the STG base as cave games and Battle Garga at this point, since the STG genre is basically solved at this point. At least KOF mainly calmed down on the releases after the whole pachinko thing following KOF 13 for the most part, so at least it's stagnating less frequently than touhou. If you want a bunch of cute girls doing dumb things, we already have plenty of gacha shit and tubers on the internet. And a bunch of the larger tuber groups and a bunch of girl collectathon gacha already have elaborate lore and shit in their settings and character backgrounds on top of that themselves. If you can control yourself, money-wise, and not splurge like $1,000 on crap, I'd actually rather you play some gacha of this ilk than touch touhou, which is something I did not see myself saying, but here we are. I'd like to preserve the R word to those like NMLGC recommending the Linen series as some sort of touhou done right, and also free smile, especially to those who already pirated the original touhou shit already. Considering how hard it was to buy the official touhou games firsthand overseas until Toby Fox coaxed Zun to release them digitally on Steam only to stop porting games entirely when Zun's lawyer got mad online over criticism and coaxed Zun to DMCA strike a bunch of shit on a huff and probably give up entirely on the Steam ports for the first 3 Windows touhou games, 6-8. That normies actually care about. No, it's not the no source code preserved frown rumor, because touhou 9 of all things got ported to Steam and all the touhou Steam releases are just the original executable binaries wrapped around Steam DRM. As for Linen proper, outside of Linen 4, it doesn't really improve on the touhou formula except for the aesthetics, the sound font and overall music, of which still doesn't even hold a candle to say Phantasmagoria Trues, whose soundtrack is mostly taken from Cintiv's royalty-free music library for God's sake, and the concept and implications behind the true last boss of Linen, to which Zero Ranger stole from. In fact, its level and boss pattern design are overall worse and oftentimes wants you to know and kill as much as you can ASAP, otherwise you'd often get fucked by its level, boss design. Lenin's only real advantage over touhou mostly has ended for the most part, whereas touhou is an eternally stagnating zombie at this point, but you are still better off playing basically anything else at this point. When Jinx decided to significantly deviate from the touhou formula beyond the aesthetics and level, boss design philosophy, we ended up with Linen 4, Beautiful Pagoda or Haze Castle, which ended up screwing itself over to justify its own gimmick of pulling a Smash Ultimate-esque everyone is here. It has every boss from the previous 3 Linen games to fight, as well as 2 touhou games worth of new characters as bosses. Unfortunately, to fit those in, it has to screw its level structure. It basically did the whole randomized enemy waves from a globalish pool shit that touhou 18.5 will later do, and added in a weird branching path system where you move left or right in a grid by staying in that relative portion of the game screen long enough for each random wave, and you either move left a stage or right a stage if you are left or right enough on the grid after beating the main stage boss, or basically play the same stage again but longer, except for the last stage, which is like 5 waves without any grid movement before the boss. Repeat for 5 more stages with a longer grid of enemy waves to deal with each time. You mainly encounter Linen 4's newcomers by staying on the right, left paths up to end of the game, the titular Beautiful Pagoda or Haze Castle routes. Otherwise you end up facing randomized bosses from the previous 3 games. To compensate for the boredom of fighting repeat waves, which can happen even in a single playthrough, is random effects per wave encounter, like turning all the bullets, Danmaku Black, which can screw you over or do nothing relevant depending on stage background. Add in a blindness, darkness effect on the screen a la Mystia from touhou 8, give you a 1-up if you beat the wave without dying or bombing, make the enemy wave stronger or weaker, or just drain your power-ups very quickly if you dare shoot the enemies in the current wave, making you plan to pacifist run each wave. You could also, instead of a random enemy wave, fight a random boss with a single Danmaku pattern to deal with. You're also beholden to the same random effects that can screw you over with normal random waves. To compensate for the BS that can happen, especially in the very long extra stage where all these aspects are at their worst, not only does the game give you a health bar per life so that usually you don't die when you get hit once for the most part, unless you toggle an option for normal STG1 death per hit behavior, but also an armor bar that also takes hits for your actual health bar while not empty, a la Gungrave or Time Splitters or GoldenEye, and recharges occasionally on top of that. Even among the player base, this is not enough for most people for extra mode, and especially the harder absurdly extra mode exclusive to Linen games. So Jinx added in a fucking elaborate upgrade progression shop system between playthroughs where you can buy up to shitin of upgrades for not only your health and armor bars but also a bunch of other shit after getting levels, skill points from repeat playthroughs. It can go up to 5,375 levels, points to get, maximize all the upgrades, at which point things get absurd and you become basically unkillable and can beat absurdly extra with a true final boss encounter even as a STG scrub, and you get fucking speedruns. https://www.youtube.com/watch v equals IA1x1g for how fast you can game over after spending maximum hash of points on all of the upgrades you can get. It took almost 11 minutes to game over in that linked video while deliberately trying to game over due to how hardy you get with all upgrades equipped. By the way, this is also probably why unlocking the extra stage for Linen 4, usually unlocked by beating the main game without continuing in at least normal mode, requires a lot of playthroughs, requiring you to beat all 8 potential final bosses of the main game, including the 2 newcomer final bosses, which means not using the best, most normalish playable character team for at least 3 playthroughs, as all 3 characters in that team are all potential final bosses themselves in the main game, funnily enough, and you can't fight against anyone in your current team you're playing as in a playthrough, and then do one playthrough to find and fight the true final boss of the main game to unlock the extra stage for each of the 4 normal playable teams. By that point you are supposed to have enough points to deal with the extra stage BS. Despite all the compromises in order to accomplish the goal of everyone is here while kinda sorta still keeping the touhou formula as much as possible intact. 6 STG stages and 1 extra stage. Lenin 4 still is less worse than touhou 18.5 because at least the former has effort and ambition, even if said ambition was just to add a bunch of crap into a grap to its detriment. Also Lenin probably saved itself from stagnation accidentally by making Lenin 4 as it is, not only from introducing a certain character and ended up making the all of Lenin revolve around them with a bunch of unforeseen implications for the franchise, but from making Lenin 4 hard to top in terms of effort that I don't really know if Jinx really wants to bother continuing on seriously. The only real game Jinx released for Lenin since 4 is some idle cafe RPG thing that probably hasn't even officially finished development. All those touhou fan games that aren't just STGs in the vein of the originals with are mostly just shittier versions of other official games, like they really want to make fan games but are afraid of getting nuked by the core. Fantasy Maiden Wars is just worse Super Robot Wars without the crossover aspect that SRW basically lives on and just basically repeats the plots of a bunch of the official games for the first 3 out of 4 FMW games anyways, unlike say the SRW all games which at least have their own unique plot lines for those without enough mecha experience to appreciate the proper SRW games. There's that one recent touhou fan game that I'm sure is just shittier, Zone of the Enders for those unlucky enough to know. I think its name is like Valkyria Phantasm or some shit. There's motherfucking touhou Mother, which is basically the worst game of all time, which is basically a cornucopia of random video game memes, mostly of the JoJo, Nintendo and Gradius, R-type variety, and melodrama whose message is that Jinchurikyo's soul is weighed down by gravity so fucking hard that your average Nintendo character can kick their asses as. There's like 2 different touhou flavored Mega Man Battle Network, Rockman.x games, 3 different touhou flavored Mega Man X games, and also Mega Mari and like a gazillion touhou flavored Mega Man classic games made by the dude behind Rockman R, Dr. Wily's Counterattack, his original actual, proper Mega Man fan game, featuring the Airman stage from hell, https://b/8dap79ue. Ballsy enough to want to be sold for money before Capcom stepped in to fix that travesty. Pretty sure all of those touhou man fan games would make you apologize to whatever Mega Man games you currently hate, common examples like Bass, Battle Network 4, X6, maybe X7, if you were to play them due to their sheer badness. There's that touhou fan game that's just Kirby Dream Land 1 but with touhous who only stands on its own due to big tits and a giant skeleton Moku who you don't even get to fight, and is probably just a wimpy new Super Mario Bros. With final boss Giant Bowser reference, even though we already got 3 different official Kirby Dream Land 1s, the original Kirby Dream Land 1, Spring Breeze from Superstar Ultra, and Revenge of the King from Superstar Ultra. There's that touhou RPG that's just Super Mario RPG but with a much weaker art style and some horniness to cover the soullessness, like all the characters having giant tits, Dormy carrying a pink dildo, a giant Hekasha boss fight with giant tits that I hope to God that you can actually target and hit individually, as that would at least be something semi-inspired. All these fan games feel like that they are built for people who finally fit the touhou fan, not excited to play the official games for the first time and that won't play anything that isn't touhou, but instead tell me to not bother with touhou and play other things that these fan games copy from. Play either Zone of the Enders game, except for maybe Zoe 2 on hard mode. Instead of that one recent touhou fan game, play any Mega Man and not any of these touhou posers attempting to steal their flair. Play any official Mother or hell any game other than fucking touhou Mother. Play Super Robot Wars all games, or the normal Super Robot Wars games if you're already a big mecha fan to appreciate, instead of Fantasy Maiden Wars. Or play any Front Mission if you want a mecha turn-based strategy game that's actually good. Or play Fire Emblem or the dozens of turn-based strategy games available even if you outright hate mecha. I guess in a way that official touhou, especially more recently, is a shittier version of other things. At the very least it basically made itself known as a shittier Dodonpachi, or the shittier side of the Danmaku pond. At this point, Antimony of Common Flowers is a shittier Persona 4 with the concept of the shadow dream incarnations of the cast, Seija and Shimumaru are shittier versions of Gitsis and In from Pokemon Black and White. The whole animal Yakuza thing from 2017 is apparently inspired by the Kimono Friends too, which though pretty much everybody hated for a variety of reasons, so I'm guess. The Ultramarine Orb Elixir from 2015 is basically the Zero System from Gundam Wing, but an elixir you drink instead of the Zero System being a helmet and floppy disk connected to a computer, in that they both experience potential futures over and over and let you pick the best one ASAP. Unfortunately, the elixir is just a shitty desperate attempt to capture the restart at checkpoint mechanics of earlier STGs like R-Type and whatnot that got retconned for being too problematic for the status quo. On the other hand, the Zero System at least was part of Gundam Wing's attempt, alongside the unmanned eye-controlled mecha mobile dolls, at tackling the difficult question of how an artificial intelligence affects war and humanity's place in war, and whether it ruins the point and nature of war of humans fighting each other. While Gundam Wing, perpetually confused to what it wants to be and say, ended up scrapping that question and moving on to something about foolish try-hard pacifism in war or something before turning into Char's counterattack, Wing Edition, for the ending of the base anime, with the message of I guess at the very least tragic wars lead to proper peace for a while once people figure out how bad war is, I guess, before the Gundam Wing endless waltz over put amok in that piece because Gundam Wing can't make up its mind. It still is a far better excuse for using such a plot device than TOO's equivalent Elixir being a desperate attempt at capturing the good old days of restart at checkpoint upon death STGs, probably for the wrong American, Western crowd, which were probably more inclined to credit feed, whereas the Japanese arcade crowd basically followed an honor system of 1 credit per playthrough, period, so that people waiting in line can actually play the arcade machine after you instead of waiting for you to spend 8 hours on a single stage. TOO and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. It basically ate the gen scene somehow, and it made STGs worse by helping push the modern STG scene to being comprised of mostly Dodonpachi, Cave-likes and TOO-likes made primarily to spite Onsen half the time nowadays, with some people being daring enough to make Gradius-likes who can't wait to show you how totally Gradius-like they are. It's basically one big reason why I became, or more accurately, stayed an R-Type apologist after my tastes gotten more refined over the years. Sun basically accidentally put a target on his head by being inexplicably popular enough to make the same game like 20 times with minor gimmicks per game a la Pokemon and less overall soul as time goes on, the later games only being made in a matter of weeks and months each out of obligation mostly, while Zun spends the rest of each year going to conventions and kinda sorta babysitting random mangaka making too many fucking shitty aimless official canonical-ish works for him. Seems like a lot of fangames basically end up hating Zun at the end despite making shit off of his own property, which makes me almost pity him. Almost. There's Fantasy Maiden Wars, whose 4th game apparently goes into Zun, and all canon purists are bad frown after spending 3 games basically going through the checklist of plot lines of the official TOO games from 6 to 11 inclusive, except for maybe 9, with some PC 98 stuff sprinkled in, with the main villain wanting everything to be exactly like the official games in terms of canonically and not whatever the fuck the developers of FMW were going for, which is basically only the Meyer and Dweebs from TOO UFO really matter, both in fighting ability and in plot functionality, in the long run, because they have a big flying ship that can stand in as a typical SRW warship where everybody hangs out in, most likely. Everything else, aside from Reimu and Yorihime, probably meant to be the Thunder God Sids of FMW, meant for easier play, Yorihime especially. Reimu does get some development bones but not much aside from special moves and shit over the games. Marissa and Alice pair together, because the epic mouse cannon meme which makes you rather play instead Contra 3/Spirits to abuse a similar exploit, or Alien Solitaire where such a exploit can't happen, Decipher being the epic healer. And basically everything else either becomes worthless when the Myrans come around or starts off worthless due to one reason or another. Shinki and Yutaga Arasu Atsuho not being pairable with anybody for one, Remilia for being nerfed from her boss form when she joins and would probably not fare well even if she had Scarlet Jinsukyo from her boss form, etc. There's Danmaku, who probably made the Danmakufu engine he used undesirable to Japan by declaring that his game, concealed the conclusion, is superior to Zun's work. Which is kinda true, in at least that it signifies an end to the series rather than an eternal cycle of stagnation, which leads to the modern day of China being the main country of the TOO fangame scene nowadays, with the Lua STG engine much to the stagnating Japan TOO fanbase's chagrin probably, and they probably see Zun in a less than favorable light anyways themselves. There's this weird obsession with Marissa, to the point where people like Xanos has people like Byakuran and Hakaisha obsessing over Marissa for being the most important, and probably strongest, person ever when the, at least, original intent of Marissa is that she's supposed to be the most normal and everyman of the cast, who is at best barely stronger than Suno. Marissa apparently BTFOs Hakaisha so fucking hard the latter gets drill corncobbed by the moment, and as a coping mechanism has dreams where she has a bunch of the weaker Yukai characters stop the evil magician trio, Marissa, Alice, and Patchly, from enslaving Jinsekyo or some shit, and dreams so goddamn hard that said Yukai starts sleepwalking and stealing machi hammers from Tae at night for the purpose of said dream. Marissa is like the last person to live in someone's head rent-free, but probably because of the funny overpowering glitches with the touhou 10 and the funny Contra 3 swap bug for touhou 8, Marissa is actually the strongest and most important person ever. Only concealed the conclusion really handled the Marissa is important actually thing semi-well. And it's more because it's a more mild passing the torch from one main character to another than most important person, because while glitches like We're the Pokemon fandom at the time when Missing No and Glitch City were the source of many horror fanfic stuff, there's touhou Mother who basically goes Jinsekyo is bad, and its inhabitants base their lives spouting and owning memes based on other popular intellectual properties, which can be seen as an accidental indictment of touhou as a whole, a nightmare franchise that lives as a copy of other franchises. It seems that touhou can only really be enjoyed on a superficial, secondary level, attempting to genuinely care about and on a primary level, beyond them just posting touhou-flavored memes and fumos, makes you hate it and spend your life spiting it instead, like for example in MLGC, who stared too deep into the touhou abyss to say the least and decided to spend his last years with touhou reverse engineering the PC98 games. Not out of love but instead probably to spite Zun with whatever bugs and code he could find being stolen from other gen makers at the time. I know that Zun is indeed scum, but any fandom whose apparently most involved members hate the creator of the franchise they're obsessed with is definitely cancerous. Not sure why the group that spends time rightfully sneering at people making content for IPs and genres that they hate and want to subvert, spite, like Tainim's DMC, Devil May Cry, Rooster Teeth's Genlock, and also legendary Defender Voltron apparently, should give touhou a pass at this point, since it's basically filled at its core of people that either hate it or no longer genuinely cares about it on a deep level other than money, I guess. Zun probably fits the latter to a T at this point. Also by design, touhou is basically seeped way too deep into full-on death of the author territory by its own fandom, both Japanese and otherwise, so I don't know why the death of the audience gang would give touhou a pass despite being purists in that the only interpretation, analysis of a thing must be based on what the author says explicitly, an interpretation based on assumptions or contradicting what the authors have said, like the Final Fantasy VIII's Renoa equals Ultimsha theory confirmed to contradict the word of God at some point, is considered bad and grooming, probably to avoid cases like Mosuk's saying that Kill La Kill is Marxist because poor people are on the side of the good guys, or Bomber Guy saying that Kill La Kill is feminist because of. Ever since Sun basically confirmed that his shit is basically no longer official canon, and thus his works have no internal merit by being made by the fucking creator, kinda, of the fucking franchise compared to everyone else, his only true purpose at this point is to shit out more official characters in any way he can for the rabble and assholes to make shitty headcanons and interpretations in any way they see fit at this point. Like saying that Donald Trump Maiko is trans because they mention getting a new body in their backstory when it's likely that they're intended to be basically touhou's version of Archery, a Pendragon from Fate, Stay Night, and that they were born and were always female but history wrote them as male, or that Suno is Rimu's daughter in some form because Suno and the fairies are like one of few weak, or somewhat sympathetic to the weak, people Rimu doesn't outright hate somehow basically. Or that Rimu is autistic because a so-called solo developer somehow has too many conflicting writers in his wing, that Rimu's character at this point is a disaster piece of epic proportions and is probably a former racist that eventually now secretly just hates the weak despite being weak and worthless herself because funny hypocrisy is cool for a main character, basically a proto-infinite from Sonic Forces but with no fandom Ruby to save her, or Silver from Pokemon Gold, Silver but more stupidly written somehow, or basically she's the embodiment of this. https://cdn.discord.com/attachments/834895801831655/10321219905066312009/unknown.png. Zun is basically Japanese low tax, in both being perpetually drunk and also barely ruling over an empire of dirt that made things worse for everyone else overall. I expect the equivalent divorce proceedings and the suicide to about if Twitter and by proxy touhou disintegrate at some point. In the end, Zun is the cuck that can't. A cuck that can't code. Especially not now, since all he does is just add and remove gimmicks from the code randomly for each game now, and likely still has that fucking game manual Stack Overflow bug which acts as one of touhou's many eerie parallels to Final Fantasy IV of all things, namely similar to FF4 Seamless's fucking deadly stair traps speedrunners used to skip to and cheese zero miss via some funky RAM manipulation shenanigans, though in touhou is much less useful unfortunately, aside from like one screenshot of an extra stage played in normal mode with a corrupted score beyond the counter's top limit or something, which only makes people upset that they had to patch the recent games for any meaningful scoring play at this point, since Unlong dropped the ball on scoring mechanics by now. A cuck that can't do sound fonts well and is mainly a Squidward playing the wrong notes, which technically sounds more originally for a bunch of Jin stuff to show him how to play the right notes and then kindly fuck off. The main problem with touhou music is that it's very one-note generic and inspired bombastic for the most part. Zun is basically like Moto Sakuraba, whose only main emotions in his songs are calm and battle zone, in that Zun makes like 3 types of songs total in his own career, especially for his games: stage songs, boss songs, and some melancholy stuff relegated to the main menus and endings of each game that usually share the same funny touhou motif. You could easily swap the music of one stage with that of most other stages in official touhou and nobody will bat an eye. You could almost similarly swap boss music without people batting an eye, especially if you swap an early stage boss song with another early stage boss song or final boss song with another final boss song. One of the few, if only, notable exceptions to the touhou rule is the Stage 6 stage for touhou 15, which should have continued as is for the actual Junko boss fight instead of another generic final boss song with a dumb electric guitar of obnoxiousness, since the former better fits someone who is supposed to be greatly calmed down due to standing in the fucking ocean of the Lunarian moon for 2 fucking years waiting for Ching and all Lunarians to come to her after being used and abandoned by the funny Hell Goddess and her funny American flag Hell Fairy as a weapon to get back at the moon, only to be later be accused by the Hell Fairy of crystallizing fairies at the end of the fairy manga. So casually sorry you dumb Hekashaks Junko turds. But I guess An is so afraid of stepping on Taito's shoes copyright-wise that he's afraid of using proper theming and symbolism for songs now, similar to Zun not letting Rimu use her Go-Hi for anything aside from a mechanic gimmick in touhou 14 for fear of the whole Seo-chan comparison, up to ditching the Go-Hi entirely in her player sprite for touhou 15 on, since touhou 14 provided an excuse for to make a proper Go-Hi less sprite to use forever and leaving the Go-Hi literally just there to look funny in title screens. The funny Go-Hi that gets longer per game and that's its only purpose. This and the whole shitty sound font thing is why I reserve the funny R word to people who think Zun's music is hot stuff comparable to any video game OST greats, whether it be stuff like pretty much any Final Fantasy OST from 4 on, except for like FF5. The Gilgamesh Big Battle Bridge song is overrated and the rest of FF5's OST is mostly mid and has sound font issues. Still better than touhou stuff though, or Chrono Trigger and Cross, or any Zuntata OST, or most, all Wild Arms OSTs, or Main Abunamaki's work at Cave and elsewhere, or Einhander, or Chain Dive, or Donkey Kong Country 2, or even fucking Gaia Seed and Threads of Fate for the PS1, and yet this shit led to people ruining their careers to turn the Jin scene into a fucking shitty Orosi remix that only fixates on one fucking franchise to own a person's wrong notes. While you could argue that OC Remix only really focuses on remixes of SNES, SFC stuff over other consoles, at least it's more than one fucking franchise and thus more overall variety of music to work with. It makes things funny when people want to use touhou music for their MMDs or fan videos of some sort or another and only use like the 3 songs total from the Tisofro touhou fighters over and over and over and over again, as those are the only songs that come close to fitting average casual scenes that make up most touhou fan content in general, because every other official touhou song is for action or adventuring and we know touhou fans and the videos they shit out can't handle action or adventuring or any suspense in general for a wide variety of reasons. A cuck that can't write, whether by himself or when working with other people. He probably doesn't even work with people, just lets them do whatever and take the credit himself like a stooge, which is why he eventually admits that canon and characterization are just a suggestion and that he's nothing more than an official character factory compared to the rest of the fanon. The ironic thing about Zun hiring a bunch of mangaka to write for him for what constitutes most of the official touhou franchise, aside from the fact that he still is considered as this epic single developer, is that most of them, aside from like the fairy manga series, the only thing that isn't complete shit, basically become the same thing. A bunch of random shit happens because of a big mystery or culprit. The cast never gets around to solving the case or mystery themselves properly until the ending happens, in which relevant things start actually happening and the answer is basically given up front, basically out of fucking pity. Basically, nothing happens until the ending happens, all something like Clue Fiat 2. The phenomenon is basically an excuse for stupid shit, and the details of said phenomenon are probably not even fully realized by Sun up until he and or the mangaka decide to end their respective manga, and are basically an excuse for otherwise unrelated shit to happen. Take the Kaisen manga, which basically just exists to tell us that Kaisen and by proxy Kamiki are the only good touhous and everybody else is a worthless R-word psychopath actually that acts as antagonists to her, especially Rimu. This is basically what started the whole thing of you're supposed to hate the whole touhou cast entirely, aside from whatever Sun decides to shill at the moment for certain view bases like Sumiko for Isekai obsessed Zoomers or Clown Piece for Americans, and they're all worthless assholes with all bark and no bite, and the only really main difference between them is job description, like Rimu is the worst cop ever, because American cops are bad, or AI is the worst journalist ever that cancel cultures people for no reason other than because American journalists are bad. Frown. It eventually ends with a whole fight between Rimu and Kaisen's original evil half walking around hell that Zun apparently planned since the beginning, or at least a Rimu vs Kaisen fight in general. touhou 13 apparently was supposed to end this series with a Kaisen extra stage boss fight, but the whole shitty manga thing probably put a wrench in that plan and left the series to eternal stagnation, but isn't really connected to the whole Kaisen is the bestest Eva and everybody else is a shit stain that the whole fucking manga paraded around up to that point. Of course, since Rimu is nerfed to a bitch by then, unlike the Silent Sinner is Blue thing where Rimu loses according to the JP fandom by going to a draw by threatening to yell slurs or jack off against Yorihime, who is basically meant to be to Rimu what Metal Sonic is to Sonic or what Mandrake is to Dexter or W.E. Basically I'm you but evil and 1000x better except for a weakness here or there. Rimu just uses Fantasy Seal at eviler Kaisen, fused with the good Kaisen at this point, unsuccessfully. Gives up only for Tenshai to tell her exactly what to do. That good Kaisen either probably foolishly thought Rimu would figure out on her own, or thought so little of her that she probably told Tenshai off screen what to do before joining to fuse with evil Kaisen so that Rimu could chop her right arm off and basically revert evil Kaisen to said right arm. Then after this reveal we don't even get to see the end of the fight, we just cut to after the battle with evil Kaisen as a right arm again dancing in a box for good Kaisen to watch over. The end. Then there's Forbidden Scrollery, the Kosazu manga, which is really just the Rimu is bad manga part 2, Electric Boogaloo. A bunch of dumb shit happens that we learn at the end is connected to one specific cursed book hiding in Kosazu's bookstore thanks to Yuka Uri in a stupid plan to stop the Yukai trying to exploit the human village by causing a bunch of stupid shit for the humans to blame the Yukai on, which probably doesn't even solve the problem of Mamizu and AI grooming Kosazu and attempting to exploit the human village overall for their own ends, since the latter two disguise themselves as humans in the first place, kinda ruining the overall intent of Yuka Uri's plan in the first place. Rimu and Marissa and the gang never get around to solving this before the ending, where the reveal throws the answer at us. Instead it's basically showcasing how dumb and stupid they are at their job. Like Rimu, who will gleefully kill off a random NPC for daring to turn into a Yukai, and would probably have killed Kosazu for being possessed by the cursed book if Yuka Uri didn't intervene to plot dump at the reader and give up. But Mamizu and AI grooming Kosazu for nefarious ends, that's okay apparently, since Yuka Uri is bad. Frown. And the manga ends with them partying as if nothing is wrong. If I want a manga, anime where we get child grooming left unquestioned, I'd rather go with Dragon Maid, or preferably Cardcaptor Sakura, but I don't know if that particular romance plot is similar enough to this or Dragon Maid's cases, at this point, because there it's probably more as a joke or fetish material at worst than whatever the fuck is going on in Forbidden Scrollery. Then there's the Detective Satori manga, which is basically the Member Berries manga where it just and goes through the motions, basically going through the cast of each Windows Zero game in order, having the culprit of the plot put people to sleep through her funny possession shenanigans to avoid having to write certain characters on, and all the mangaka don't have the heart to touch for fear of angering people like Alice. Mainly it's just Rimu and Marissa fucking up and getting captured by the main players of each Windows era game up to at least 8. Eventually it just gives up on the mystery and gives us the identity of the culprit straight up. All these shitty excuses of mysteries make fucking Scooby-Doo look like high art. Then it has Rimu go on a mental breakdown about how worthless she is. And unfortunately this is basically Sun and the mangaka mocking her at this point rather than a tragic moment. We're supposed to basically respond with stop fucking crying bitch. Wah, 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 I don't want to fucking hear it. Even the fairy manga side of things, the least shitty of the main manga over the years, isn't really immune to this. Though it at least wasn't holding off dealing with a big mystery in a reasonable fashion up until its own ending. It still has the whole problem of the issue of the final arc being solved by like one person and the rest of the active cast in that arc being unable to do the things that they should for whatever, which is unfortunately more apparent here. Why doesn't Rimu or Marissa bother to go at least investigate what's crystallizing the fairies of Jinsukyo? Why do they both have to just stay at the shrine with their collection of fairy crystals instead of one staying and potentially fighting Hellspawn that want to eat the fairy crystals while the other tries to solve the issue? Is this to better justify the one-sided fight between the fairies and Okaina? Considering how nerved Rimu is in the modern incarnation of touhou, being just bad American cop, I very much doubt that she, or Marissa for that matter, could do much to turn the tide on the fairies' battle against Okaina. It's probably implied that the season mechanics in touhou 16 are the only reason that Rimu and Suno stood a chance against Okaina in the first place. And even if Rimu could turn the tide, she can probably be too late to actually participate in the actual battle before Okaina figures out that Clown Piece is not trying to fuck up Jinsukyo or figure out that it's the side effect of Okaina's shenanigans in touhou 16 crystallizing the fairies despite being established in the case in manga earlier that she knows about Okaina in whatever the fuck the canon is supposed to be. Which kinda shows how stupid having multiple mangaka work on separate manga for a single franchise at once really is, since it's unclear whether they have the same idea of what the canon even is, particularly how touhou 16 happened officially and who actually bothered to deal with the incident there, since I doubt Sun has an official bible of how things are supposed to work as he should. Also, why is Okaina in a wheelchair? I know that touhou 16 was supposed to have a goddess of disabilities sitting on a wheelchair as the final boss at one point, but I doubt that original idea is that much similar enough to what eventually became Okaina in the final release to warrant giving Okaina a wheelchair, and it makes it look like Sun or whatever wanted to feel meta or whatever by jangling and beta elements in our faces. The touhou mangas after Silence Inner and Blue, except for the fairy manga somewhat, illustrates and emphasizes the big problem with touhou is that it's the most insincere thing ever. The worst of the manga are mean-spirited as fuck, with the active cast being either miserable assholes with no purpose in life than being assholes without explanation, with Rimu, Ai being the worst, or those like Mei and Kasazu who instead get bullied by said miserable assholes. Nobody gets to grow or punished for their direct actions. All their actions end up not mattering other than a reinforcement of nihilism and negativity. It feels like a tragedy of dunces that treats itself as a comedy, as if the general miserableness of the setting itself is the joke. The one, most intended, message that goes through is this fucking attitude of hey, imagine caring about anything here in Jinsukyo, you fool. All they are, really, are just tools, skins to pair with each other, whether it be fan art bait and or making dumb quips, which especially doesn't gel with the fact that Zun spends way more time on the manga that's meant to further characterize the cast than the games, which by design can't really do more than quips per battle and some make stuff. It makes me ask how much of this shit is Sun's idea, directly at least, and how much of it is the mangaka's idea to make a mockery of the franchise like this. I don't see Sun as a storyboard guy, so I don't know how he would convey to the mangaka each chapter to be written. But he probably just gave each mangaka a rough draft of events for the manga, probably some bullet points, and the mangaka wrote the rest with Zun taking what the mangaka shits out as canon for himself kinda. If a lot of these stupid elements were Zun's idea, then the fandom probably has much sway in him that they are probably dumb-headed responses to whatever the fandom is treating touhou, whether taking their ideas, like Rimu being an R word from people saying she is for not beating Nurhim fairly in sub, Kaisen being basically the original idea for Fantasy Maiden Wars K9, and touhou 15 being basically the original draft for Fantasy Maiden Wars 4 apparently, or spiting the fanbase, the whole Trump manga thing to own 2ch Trumpists and or dumb Americans or something, Ija just being evil for evil's sake to avoid being shipped with other people only for people to ship her anyways because fanon does not care what Zun thinks. The most pessimistic reasoning I can think of for why the touhou psyop that decided to make touhou popular in the first place, wherever it may have came from, was a thing in the first place, is to strike down the jin scene by making someone like Sun that was never actually a jinist in the first place the main face of the jin scene. He's basically an Anakin of jinists. He made PC 98 games, but he is unfit to the Council of Jinists due to breaking many of the traits of jinists himself. And he got palpated into his role somehow, and those who tried to fit into the new touhou normal end up failing horribly over the years because touhou was never meant to be as big as it got, and it showed. It could also be that the rest of the jin scene was as bad as Sun, but were never popular enough for their skeletons in their respective closets to start showing. I dunno, and this was actually a mercy killing, but hey. On the other hand, the more optimistic reasoning I can guess is that it was an attempt to allow fan games in a larger and more legal level to avoid trouble with a core that went completely astray, which probably explains why 99% of touhou fan games are shittier versions of other games that mock the touhou IP. They're mixing awkwardly with the gameplay of a much better IP. Which makes me say that we should give up on the modern trend of trying to make ultra-elaborate legally distinct copies of games we liked as children that still end up missing the point of the original products in the first place. Whether it's modern boomer shooters whose enemy roster aren't quite as formidable and memorable as Doom 2's enemy roster, wow, so retro stuff that have too many cal stuff and cheating to actually fit their retro graphics and are just using said retro graphics as a crutch for good art, games like Signalis that really love to signal, hey, what exactly they're based on to the point of parody, and what have you. Earlier fan stuff may have proper Danmaku-ish combat occasionally, but eventually that got dropped for more melodrama and nihilism and casual stuff. Sun could have just made and played bullet patterns in engine and took a screenshot and used that to represent Danmaku combat like he did for Grimoire of Marissa, Uzami, if he were to do all the manga work himself. And I wouldn't blame him for doing that. I mean, there's Yuk and Jinx and others who made whole mini touhou games not to be played publicly but as a basis for a video to be watched, so it's not entirely a foreign concept at this point. Instead we basically got what if you GIO, but there's no card games being played or games in general, and it's just the characters reacting to phenomenon without doing anything really to stop it because games are too intensive to draw a frown. The whole spell card rules thing mandating that everything be done via Danmaku combat kinda also put a wrinkle in things actually happening in the manga side as well. Sun is a cuck who can't draw, but that's the least of his problems at this point. In fact, he should have drawn his own manga series if he wanted to make touhou a multimedia empire and isn't willing to spend more of his time making his own actual games. It worked for one with One Punch Man, which turned from a manga not really more artistically complex from Sun's ending art, which is probably what a undrawn manga or web series would look like, to a huge Japan-wide phenomenon and probably at least popular in America if not other parts of the Western world. Instead he has to depend on the ideas of others when he got other mangaka to write for him, instead of letting his art stand out on its own. It's like he wants to be this weird combination of a popular manga guy as well as a humble jinist and ending up neither instead. The art of the mangaka he employs weren't worth sacrificing ones individually and setting for at the end of the day. They aren't really interesting on their own. Closest is Moharukawa with Forbidden Scrollery, but even that isn't particularly amazing on its own to justify Rimu bad cop beaten to our heads over and over like a sledgehammer. And Moharukawa's portraits in the HD Tsufu games, Urban Legend in Limbo and Antimony of Common Flowers, are mostly shit and airbrushed to hell and back, with the only good portrait being Koishi of all things somehow. The big problem with making a fucking manga series for a Danmaku STG franchise, much less like 10 of them over 20 years, is that you can't really translate Danmaku gameplay outside of a video game where you don't have to draw every bullet manually on pen or tablet or whatever. Doing that in a manga basically leads to Toriyama Cell, from Dragon Ball Z syndrome, but instead of drawing the spots in a single character, you'd basically have to draw whole panels and pages filled with spots, which probably gave people nightmares thinking about doing that for touhou manga. For level design, despite making like around 20 games in around 20 years, Sun overcomplicates things when it comes to level design, probably by necessity of having too many fucking games to work with. Unlike most other games in general, STG or otherwise, touhou doesn't really have enemy types so to speak. Rather it's more behavior scripts randomly attached to a small set of enemy sprites, fairies, yin-yang orbs, flames, spinning FOE things. In say Doom 2, an archvillain in one level will act completely the same as an archvillain in another level, and they both act completely the same as an archvillain in a separate user-made level WOD. At best, the behavior script of an enemy type can be influenced by params passed to individual enemies of the same type to differentiate enemies of the same type from each other to a usually small bit, or the behavior script can be modified by whatever stage the enemy is in or whatever rank, difficulty the game is set at the current moment, like for example the small tanks in, especially earlier, Danmachi games being influenced by how high the rank, difficulty system is at, and by proxy mostly influenced by how far into the game session you are. Battle Geargas enemies are an even bigger example if mainly due to how esoteric Geargas difficulty, rank system is in comparison to Danmachi's. But despite all this, enemies of the same type are still bound to the same behavior script for the most part. In touhou, though, each individual enemy or small set of enemies in each individual stage have their own completely original behavior script not signified by any unique enemy graphic. A fairy in one part of the level may just fire bullets straight at you, while a fairy with the same exact graphic in another part of the same level will instead be a mid-boss with elaborate danmaku patterns and lots of health, and yet they'll both be different from yet another fairy of the same graphic in the same level somehow. This may seem to increase enemy uniqueness by not really reusing enemies unlike other games, but it doesn't really allow you to use enemies to their full potential, as modern Doomwats and to a lesser extent Super Mario World hacks can, and have be able to have behavior patterns for multiple potential situations, since they're going to be used once or twice in a single level at best and then put away never to be used again. So their behavior patterns become static and or simple, and you can't really use your knowledge of enemy types to deal with future uses of said enemy types. It also makes developing levels much harder since you basically have to have hundreds of enemy types for each individual game, which is a problem when you design games as a somewhat one-man team from start to finish in a matter of weeks to months each. Impossible Spell card took like 3 weeks tops to develop, for one, and also 4 difficulty levels per game to design around on top of that. So you can't really polish anything at all. I guess it's a necessity if you're going to have around 20 games using similar engines in around 20 years and are desperately trying to make them not seem like level packs or DLC of each other that you're selling for like $20 each, on top of having a couple of gimmicky mechanics per game, but it really damns the practice of having around 20 fucking games in around 20 fucking years if you have to sacrifice so much in level design to justify such a goal. As for the bosses, the problem with touhou bosses is not really exclusive to touhou but more generally to Danmaku STGs in general, where the bosses barely move and aren't really dynamic, and the challenge of most of them is to align yourself horizontally with them to do more damage and make the Danmaku patterns end quicker, making sure not to move too much from the boss's vertical axis because that often gets you killed. Touhou is more egregious in this regard in that the bosses are all barely bigger than your player's sprite, which gives them less excuse to do more than just sway along the screen occasionally. Makes all the bosses feel samey when the boss isn't going all gimmick on your ass with a funny survival pattern or I think the few official touhou bosses I remember having elaborate movement that can sufficiently stay away from your vertical axis is like the Stage 2 boss, Chin, from PCB, and that's more of a gimmick than anything. So basically the only real movement you have to do is put yourself in level of the boss and just shoot lol, making sure to avoid. Compare this with say the Stage 3 boss of R-Type 2, which is like more than half the size of the fucking screen and moves around all over the place more than most touhou bosses ever do, and to kill it you have to fire on and destroy the blue pods floating around and also flying all over the place that also like to fire lasers on you when they get level with you, and like to hide inside the boss itself in the top part guarded by a rotating turret wall that, while destructible, also fires quick lasers when you're level with it to fuck you over. And I actually think the boss has a timeout phase where he can just run you over if you dilly-dally. At least it feels like it, though the boss may actually be mobile enough that I could just be mistaken. So you either spend more time looking for more sure openings and risk getting run over, or you rush and also risk dying to a random laser you can't really see coming. Either way, you are never really staying in one place at any point for long and is mostly moving all over the place. Nowadays modern STGs all end up being either a Danmaku thing with some combination of cave, Yagawa, and touhou elements, or a lol just text game again that you liked but shit now, like all those JP Gradius clones. Which makes me respect Gradius 5 for trying to innovate somewhat and bucking at least a couple of trends despite still finding it overrated myself. Or that R-Type Leo wannabe Dragon STG thing I saw in a stream once that I forgot the name of. No matter how elaborate the scoring system of your 2010s and later STG is, most people are going to focus on scoring like a handful of STGs at best, and one game at worst. which are going to be mostly just the cave stuff and battle Gaga at this point, with like a handful of people each for other STGs just to feel unique. Most other STGs aside from cave stuff and Gaga, and maybe Ikuga, whether made before or after those, are only really played for the novelty factor up to in 1cc, 1 credit clear, for a YouTube video of some sort and then dumped forever. Since STGs popular for scoring exist, there's no more reason to make any more, since people will flock to the STGs popular for scoring and will never really expand to whatever people decide to make nowadays. For touhou games, especially touhou STG fan games nowadays, it's an extra insult, since all those pump and dump 1cc clears you see on YouTube all are just lunatic in MNBNC, no miss, no bomb, no C button, or equivalent clears that outright ignore the gimmicky mechanics of the game being in MNBNC'd as much as possible, which makes everything feel even more samey. The problem with these Danmaku STG games is that they're basically one note that applies to like all of them. The same general strategies you could apply to one Danmaku STG basically apply to all of them at once. You play one of them, especially one of the harder ones like Daijutsu or 1cc, you're basically set for all of them. All there is aside from the general ways of dealing with Danmaku is rote memorization for things you can't really dodge on your first try. At best, gimmicky mechanics per STG just add something to do alongside the usual motions for scoring or getting more resources for survival or whatever. Ironically, fucking user-made Doom level WODs have more unique level design variety over the like 3 decades that OG Doom 2 has been around than all those damn Danmaku STG games do combined, probably because OG Doom is a more complex game overall than one-note Danmaku stuff, despite Doom technically having less enemy variety than most STGs, whether the latter go full to a unique behavior script for every fucking enemy or not, and thus have more mechanics to work around, but simple enough for Joe Schmoey to get into making Doom levels of some form. Doom level pack WODs, especially more modern ones, already share some of the general strategies of dodging normal projectiles as Danmaku STGs do, but simply because of extra mechanics like ammo management, more variety of things to worry about like hitscan enemies, revenants homing projectiles, and most importantly actual fucking level geometry. You can have a variety of encounters with unique solutions aside from a generic use of circle strafing for everything ever. If you're not a scoring person, and I am definitely not, and you're looking for a fresh difficult game genre to work with, you'd be better off buying and trying Doom 1 and or 2 as well as TNT and Plutonia from Final Doom, and then looking at or watching Mount Payne's Dean of Doom videos. https://www.youtube.com/c/mountpain27/videos, to some extent for good Doom Leave pack WODs to play around with like Strife 2, Eternity, Alien Vendetta, Ancient Aliens, Heartland or whatever. You'd probably have a better time overall with Doom at this point, and it's all with basically just level mods for one fucking game. Previously, prior to the overall Danmakuization of the STG genre, probably partly or mostly caused by touhou and or cave STGs, STGs were of course more varied. Even if you discount Western stuff like Sin on 1/2 or Tyrion and limit yourself to just Japanese STGs, you can find plenty of variety earlier on, at least between different game companies. For one, you could see Thundercross as similar to Gradius, I guess, both being made by Konami, but Gradius, Battle Gaga, R-Type, Raiden Fighters, Darius, Toxujin, Truxton, Thunder Force 3/4/5/6, Thunder Dragon 1, Thunder Dragon 2, Haka Mecha Fighter, R-Type Leo, Ikuga, Radiant Silver Gun, Scramble, Steel Empire, Ray Force, Ray Crisis, Reflex, Hellsinger, all feel more different from each other than two modern Danmaku STGs like touhou stuff and cave stuff, especially from 2010s on, do without outright deviating from the STG formula to an unrecognizable degree for people to count. Zun is just a leech that leeches off of others despite purporting as a single individual creator, whether leeching off of Disofro for anything not a STG until they're left with just like 2-3 people period, and obviously can't really finish even what is basically just Sonic but with just bosses lol in a timely fashion, and had to finish it later with DLC even after multiple delays. Leech off the fan base for ideas, trying to either appease them or spite them depending on how he's feeling after his morning beer. Leeching off of the mini mangaka he worked with until either or some give up and end each individual manga more abruptly and stupidly than most manga endings more prominent manga critics in YouTube or whatever would call the worst ending ever, or W.E. touhou as a whole is basically a virus deep within its bowels, tainting those who go on too deep until they get corrupted beyond repair, like the aforementioned touhou going from the niche but decent Eternal Fighter Zero to the touhou fighters that mainly exist to make Mugen cheapies for Bilibili, Sprit Club cockfights off of or are basically worse melee at best, Hisotensoku, the latter that has to be patched to be properly enjoyed without the weather system gutting things up, and touhou ending up with 2-3 people left in the company total at the end of it all. The memories of phantasm people turning into Japanese MAGA Trumpists somehow. The Japanese MMD community consuming itself after Nicovideo's reign waned and largely replaced by the Chinese, and otherwise, on that front. That one company making the earlier touhou Vanias, not Luna Nights, eventually going bankrupt shortly after, etc. 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 Touhou hates itself. Touhou is a series that can only be enjoyed superficially or ironically. You either like it for the funny girls that are always shown wanting to fuck each other in 99% of fan art or fan anything really and never bothering to go deeper than that for your own sanity, or you go deeper into it and finding yourself a fan that fucking hates everything about it and wanting to fix or expose everything about it ever to owns on and or everybody that still cares about it. Like all those Fire Emblem fans that like it but hate the anime, Japanese parts of it for being too problematic or whatever and think the games are too us or whatever but don't want to expand their horizons to other turn-based stuff. Or the people who make stuff like Shovel Knight who want to wear the retro aesthetic but don't want to commit to being retro entirely and sees its premise as a quirky Shovel Knight gimmick for the memes and for some funny dialogue than genuine care, probably because its developers are NES nesters who can only play as Capcom Disney NES games for babies like Rescue Rangers and DuckTales, which Shovel Knight seems to take its cues from and sees anything barely harder like NES Contra as literally impossible without the Konami code for 30 lives. After dabbling in arcade titles via MAME and playing games outside of the NES instance, my mind is broken away from the whole NES is Nintendo hardcore mindset people had back in the day. Unfortunately, this means that people unfairly treat the NES like worthless outdated shit due to no longer having that whole Nintendo hard appeal it once had before our horizons were expanded. But to expand on that tangent is for another day. I guess the reason for Shovel Knight piggybacking on the retro aesthetic is because sadly it's hard to make good and unique art nowadays. Unfortunately, it's easier to make good retro art than it is to make good non-retro game art since there's less colors to deal with for NES, especially if you don't want to fully commit to NES limitations. The group of people that have come the closest to genuinely enjoying touhou are JP artists, probably. Problem is that even then their work don't really attempt to care about canon events or characterization for the most part or have a naive level knowledge of such things. Probably because touhou never really had canon nor characterization despite the higher-ups insisting that there was, up until recently when Zun indirectly admitted that he had no idea what he was doing in the first place with the whole no canon or characterization thing. Anyways, and also because Japan is way more paranoid about piracy than the rest of the world and doesn't even have a proper wiki, unlike fucking the Nico Mugen or MMD scenes, or an online archive, encyclopedia attempting to explain touhou in any semi-reasonable capacity, so their more accessible avenue for touhou knowledge is through other people who mischaracterize, usually accidentally, the characters in one way or another. The fact that their work doesn't really care what the touhou world is actually supposed to be is probably for the best, kinda. If there's more thought to figure out and utilize the best interpretation of the canon and setting of the touhou universe, then we'd have more random spy drawing of the characters raping and brutally murdering each other over minor incidents and going full emo on a regular basis rather than what we got now with the nothing burger stuff that at best, worst ends up as random Yuri pairing shit of characters of various levels of loot based on the most naive and all base level of character interpretations or just because. The issue of this open-ended interpretation we got here is that basically said interpretation is completely different from person to person, and reading, playing fan shit with their own interpretation that are completely different from one another sometimes even from the same author can easily give you fucking whiplash if you try to foolishly dig deep into touhou stuff. If we are to assume to not bother with whatever the fuck the official people are saying, then that means that the characters are ironically just skins of humanoid beings at the end of the day, not really proper characters, and basically just fodder for GIFs Fumafuma merchandising in terms of actually making people money, outlasting all the other touhou plush figurine makers which basically died almost entirely around touhou 12 leaving GIFs Fumos and like a couple other plush figurine makers left for those who were excited from that one touhou figurine Twitter. You can probably easily imitate, replace the average touhou fan art more than most other art with iArt programs out there, because of this. Can't really have any action shots in your art because of how hard it is to draw Danmaku, and the touhou universe established Danmaku as an actual thing people do there and not a gameplay abstraction of epic spells without doing berserk levels of work and detail for so little purpose. Which is probably one reason why I end up recently seeing touhou art. https://hannah356/status/1594230269044609025 https://mobile.twitter.com/hannah356/status/159174838837251 Of all things that go harder than pretty much anything I saw of the touhou art side of the tracks, both JP and otherwise, have ever done, especially recently. Which is ironic in that touhou is originally meant to be mainly a franchise of girls flying around lobbing lots of magical shit at each other in epic battles, while touhou is from very early on a franchise mainly a game where you fill and clear your corner of the screen filled with different colored blobs in specific ways so you can make the game overfill your opponent's corner. Most of the establishment of touhou's lore and setting that is already there, and not bloat the setting with new shit with base level explanations that leave things for people to misinterpret, is not actually in the like 10 or more official manga but in random printed material like interviews or whatever that are pretty much impossible to find, of course, without a proper archive that a wiki can provide such things without trying your luck in JP Yahoo auctions or other random stores. Seems like the only official touhou material that actually gets perpetually reprinted up to now as far as I can tell are the touhou games, even touhou 6, ironically the portion of the touhou multimedia empire, of dirt, that Zun spends the least effort on nowadays. China and to a lesser extent the West have wikis attempting to fill that gap for the everymen who don't want to spend loads of money and time looking for official sources, but not really for Japan's side of the internet sphere. Touhou is worthless, and because it's worthless there's no reason to bother with it since your time is better spent elsewhere if the fans all fucking hate its official form in some way or another and hide in some brand of fanon. Lament the death of the Jin scene from this stupid psyop and move on. In a way I kinda wish Elon Musk would kill Twitter due to his incompetence, because Twitter is basically touhou's home for the most part since most other places like Nuka Video and 2ch don't really care about touhou at this point, and probably never did in the first place, and mainly giving up on pretending when other gacha games and games with lots of marketable gimmick girls came around like Yumamuja Morkenko or whatever. And Pixiv is killed off by art spam and westernization mucking things up there, mainly filled with touhou artists from Japan and otherwise, the JP artist crowd and those who follow them and some people who care about the gakas probably being touhou's only real JP demographics at this point, people defending anything Japanese from dumb western prudes, boring Whitman Cloudman, shit posters, Fuma fanatics, and try-hard moral OCD dweebs afraid of anything or any opinion remotely problematic to an obnoxious degree. Without Twitter, touhou would probably disintegrate at this point, which is probably for the best. It probably won't restore the Jin industry, or the Japanese games industry's former glory days by proxy, but hey. Turns out Phil Fish and Keiji Inafune were right to say that the Japanese games industry is dead. They were just years too early probably. Without the Jin industry training up and coming people, we're left with an industry subsisting on member berries or pandering to the Angloids that don't genuinely care much for Japan. With everything that isn't fucking Tango Project or Hamster, the latter now of Arcade Archives fame, being completely worthless, either failing to make new things like with Sonic Frontiers and Balan Wonderworld, the latter despite Eugene Aka's persistence, or failing to remake old things and capture the magic, whether by making shitty Unity ports with worse input lag worse than the fucking UI controller somehow or remake things for the new generation but failing to get how said things worked in the first place, repeatedly, forever.